Down to his last $7,300 and facing the imminent loss of his family's century-old farm, Thomas Miller stood out like a sore thumb among the luxury suits and designer dresses at the Riveroak County water auction. When polite snickers turned to open laughter as he placed his first bid, nobody expected what would happen next. From the depths of his worn leather satchel, Thomas produced water survey maps and historical documents that instantly silenced the room. Evidence that exposed how Clearwater Developments had systematically diverted the entire region's water supply through decades of carefully orchestrated manipulation. What followed would not only save his struggling farm, but restore justice to dozens of families whose rightful water access had been stolen through generations of corporate greed and political corruption. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Miller wiped sweat from his weathered brow as he surveyed the 15 acres that remained of what had once been Hillside Farm, a property that had supported 4 generations of his family since 1917. The morning sun illuminated fields that should have been green with spring crops, but instead revealed parched soil with only scattered plants struggling against the drought. His ancient Ford pickup sat beside the weathered 2-story farmhouse, its once blue paint now faded to a pale ghost of its former color. Inside the house his great-grandfather had built by hand, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, staring at his bank statement. 7,347. 15. 3 years ago, he'd been debt-free with over 90 acres to his name. Hillside Farm had been known throughout Riveroak Valley for its sweet corn, heirloom tomatoes, and the best peaches at the Saturday farmers market. Margaret's homemade preserves had won blue ribbons at the county fair for 15 consecutive years. But then Margaret had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Even with insurance, the medical bills had mounted quickly. Thomas had been forced to sell the southern 30 acres, prime bottomland with the best soil, to cover those expenses. Margaret had fought bravely for 18 months before passing away, leaving Thomas with crushing medical debt and an empty space at the kitchen table that no amount of time seemed able to fill. Last year, another 20 acres on the western edge had been sold to keep Emily in graduate school. "Dad, I'll drop out," she had insisted during a tear-filled phone call. "We've already lost so much," but Thomas had refused. "Your mother believed in education above everything else," he'd said firmly. "One of us is going to keep that promise." Now, with another bank payment due and the region entering its 3rd year of drought, Thomas knew that without a miracle, the Miller family legacy would soon be nothing but a footnote in county records. The certified letter that had arrived yesterday from Riveroak First Bank made that painfully clear. Without securing water rights at tomorrow's auction, his remaining crops would wither in the summer heat, and foreclosure would be inevitable by harvest time. From his kitchen window, Thomas could see the edge of Clearwater Estates, a sprawling development of luxury homes with manicured lawns and decorative fountains. The sprinklers ran daily despite water restrictions, while farmers, like Thomas had been told, to reduce usage by 70%. What had once been a valley of productive family farms had been transformed into an enclave of 5-car garages and infinity pools, all marketed as sustainable luxury living by Clearwater Developments. "You're being stubborn, Dad," Robert had told him during their last conversation. His son's voice had carried the precise diction he'd developed since becoming an environmental attorney in Seattle. "There's no shame in selling what's left and moving somewhere more affordable." Jennifer had made similar arguments from her Boston apartment. "You could get a nice townhouse with the money, Dad. Something manageable. You wouldn't have to worry about water rights or bank loans anymore." But for Thomas, Hillside Farm represented something more profound than real estate. It was his heritage, his identity. 4 generations of millers had worked this soil, had celebrated births and mourned deaths beneath this roof. His children had learned to ride bicycles on the dirt roads. Between fields, had climbed the old walnut tree by the pond, had fallen asleep to the sound of crickets through open summer windows. How could he be the one to end that legacy? There was something else too, something Thomas hadn't shared with his children. For the past 6 years, since finding a hidden compartment in his father's old desk after the funeral, Thomas had been studying a collection of documents that suggested the water shortage affecting local farms wasn't entirely natural. Edward Miller had been a meticulous record keeper, but a man of few words during his lifetime. Always check the watershed boundaries, he had told Thomas more than once. Things aren't always what they seem in this valley. Thomas had dismissed these comments as an old man's peculiarities until he discovered the hidden cache. Water surveys dating back to 1885, correspondence between his grandfather and various county officials, newspaper clippings about water disputes, all carefully preserved and organized. At first, Thomas had been confused by his father's collection, but as he studied the documents over the years, comparing historical watershed maps with current water flow patterns, a disturbing picture emerged. Water that had once served dozens of family farms appeared to have been systematically diverted through manipulated surveys, altered creek beds, and hidden dams, all benefiting the same handful of wealthy families and, more recently, Clearwater Developments. The most damning evidence was a letter from 1952, written by a county water administrator named Joseph Harmon to Thomas's grandfather. It detailed how certain influential families had been altering watershed maps and diverting underground springs for decades, gradually stealing water access from smaller farms during droughts or after foreclosures. I cannot in good conscience continue to participate in this deception, Harmon had written. These families have diverted what belongs to everyone, and the pattern goes back to the original water compact. I've documented everything but fear for my position if this becomes public. I entrust these records to you as one of the few honest men I know in this county. 3 weeks after writing that letter, Joseph Harmon had died when his car inexplicably veered off Ridge Road and into Blue River, what the local newspaper called a tragic accident on a clear day. Now, with the annual water auction scheduled for tomorrow morning and foreclosure looming, Thomas had just 7,347. 15, his last remaining savings, and a small amount borrowed from his sister. It wasn't enough to secure the water rights he needed under normal circumstances, but perhaps it would be enough for one final stand, not just to save his farm, but to expose the truth that had been buried for generations. Thomas carefully gathered his father's documents into the leather satchel that Edward Miller had carried to every water board meeting for 40 years. For months, Thomas had been verifying what he could, making copies, connecting historical evidence with current reality. He'd used satellite imagery from the university library to identify unnatural patterns in the watershed. He'd hiked into the foothills to find stone markers mentioned in the original surveys, boundary monuments that didn't match official county maps. He didn't know if it would be enough, but he had to try. Tomorrow would either mark the end of his family's legacy or the beginning of long overdue justice. The Oak Ridge County Administrative Building stood in the center of town, its modern glass facade reflecting the morning sun. Built just 5 years ago with generous support from Clearwater Developments, it had replaced the historic courthouse that had served the community for over a century. The old courthouse was now a boutique hotel catering to wealthy weekenders. From the city, Thomas parked his pickup truck between a Tesla Model X and a Range Rover. His once blue Ford, with its dented fender and rusted tailgate, looked as out of place as he felt. He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, straightened his only tie, and grabbed his father's leather satchel from the passenger seat. The annual water auction was being held in Conference Room A, a space named after Mayor Frank Davidson, who had held office for the past 18 years. Thomas paused at the sign, noting how Mayor Davidson's family name had appeared repeatedly in his father's documents, always in connection with disputed water allocations that somehow benefited the same circle of families. Thomas Miller. Well, I never thought I'd see you here. Grace Thompson approached from the building entrance, her silver hair in its usual neat bun. As the county water records administrator for nearly 3 decades, Grace knew every water right, easement, and allocation in Riveroak Valley. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Just curious to see how things go this year, Thomas replied, not entirely untruthfully. Grace's eyes drifted to the leather satchel under his arm. Curious enough to bring Edward's old briefcase, I see. A slight smile played at her lips. Your father never missed a water board meeting, though I don't recall him attending many auctions. Times change, Thomas said. Drought changes priorities. Indeed it does. Grace lowered her voice. You should know that Victor Reynolds himself is here today. The CEO of Clearwater rarely shows his face at these proceedings, usually sends his lawyers instead. She nodded toward the entrance. They're calling this auction Strategic Resource Consolidation in their investor materials. Thomas nodded, his suspicions confirmed. Reynolds's personal attendance suggested the water rights being auctioned today were particularly valuable to Clearwater, perhaps because of what redistributing them might reveal about the company's decades-long manipulation of the watershed. Thank you, Grace. He hesitated, then asked, Did you ever know Joseph? Harmon would have been before your time, I suppose. Grace's eyebrows arched in surprise. Joseph Harmon. Now there's a name from the archives. He was water administrator back in the early 50s. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Why do you ask? Just came across his name in some of my father's old papers, Thomas said casually. Seemed like they corresponded. Could be. Grace glanced at her watch. You'd better get in there. They're starting soon. The conference room was 3/4 full when Thomas entered. The front rows were occupied by men and women in business attire, their attention divided between smartphones and quiet conversations about flow rates and aquifer access. In the back sat a handful of local residents, mostly older farmers, like Thomas, there to witness another piece of their community's agricultural heritage sold to the highest bidder. Thomas took a seat in the last row, nodding to Henry Wilson, whose family had lost their orchard to foreclosure 5 years earlier after their water access had mysteriously diminished due to natural causes, according to official reports. Henry looked surprised to see Thomas, but offered a grim smile of solidarity. At precisely 10:00 a.m., Commissioner James Parker approached the podium. His family had been in county politics for 3 generations, and the Parker name appeared frequently in Thomas's collection of documents. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the annual Riveroak County Water Rights Auction, Parker announced, his voice filling the room through the sound system. Today we have 5 water allocations available, beginning with allocation block 237B, which includes access rights to the North Fork watershed, approximately 450 acre-feet annually, subject to drought restrictions. Thomas studied Parker carefully. The commissioner's family had been involved in water rights manipulation since at least the 1940s, according to his father's records. Now, Parker's son-in-law worked as legal counsel for Clearwater Developments, a connection that was rarely mentioned in public meetings. We'll start the bidding at $175,000, reflecting current market value under drought conditions, Parker continued. A murmur ran through the front rows. The opening bid was surprisingly low for water rights that could irrigate substantial acreage. Exactly. The pattern Thomas had observed in his research: create conditions for minimal competition, then acquire crucial resources at artificially depressed prices. "Do I hear $175,000? Parker asked, scanning the room. A man in the front row, Victor Reynolds himself, Thomas presumed, raised a Mont Blanc pen slightly. "175, he said without turning around. "I have $175,000 from Clearwater Developments," Parker confirmed. "Do I hear $180,000? The room remained silent. None of the other developers wanted to bid against Reynolds, and none of the farmers could afford to. $175,000 going once. Thomas felt his heart racing. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the culmination of 6 years studying his father's documents. $175,000 going twice. $200,000, Thomas called out clearly, his voice carrying through the silent room. Every head turned. Victor Reynolds, a tall man with silver hair and the confident posture of someone accustomed to getting his way, swiveled in his seat to identify the unexpected competition. "Mr. Miller," Commissioner Parker said, unable to hide his surprise. "You're bidding $200,000 for allocation block 237B. "That's right," Thomas replied, standing so everyone could see him. He was acutely aware of his worn jeans and faded flannel shirt among all the business suits, but he stood tall. Reynolds whispered something to the woman beside him, then raised his pen again. "$250, he said smoothly, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't the money that amused him. Reynolds routinely dealt in millions, but the presumption that this farmer thought he could compete. $300,000, Thomas countered immediately. A ripple of astonishment moved through the conference room. Henry Wilson was staring at Thomas as if he'd lost his mind. Perhaps he had. Reynolds turned fully in his seat now, studying Thomas with unconcealed curiosity. $400,000, he said, his voice hardening slightly. $500,000, Thomas replied without hesitation. The whispers grew louder. Commissioner Parker was looking increasingly uncomfortable. This wasn't how these auctions typically proceeded. "Mr. Miller," Parker said, clearing his throat, "county regulations require verification of ability to pay before accepting bids above $250,000. Do you have such verification with you today?" And there it was, the procedural obstacle that had been used countless times to disqualify unwanted bidders. Thomas had expected this, had seen it documented in his father's papers. "I can provide proof of funds for my initial bid of $200,000, Thomas said, reaching into his pocket for his bank statement, showing his $7,247. 15 balance, plus a conditional letter from Riveroak Agricultural Credit Union approving him for a $195,000. Loan, a loan he had no intention of taking, but which served his purpose today. As for the higher bids, I believe county regulations only require proof of the initial bid amount at auction, with verification of full funding to follow within 72 hours. That's according to County Water Statute 54.3, Section 7, Paragraph 2. Parker blinked, clearly surprised that Thomas was familiar with the exact regulation. "That's technically correct, Mr. Miller. However, $1 million, Reynolds interrupted, his voice cutting through Parker's hesitation. The CEO had turned fully around now, facing Thomas directly. $1 million cash. No financing, immediate transfer. The room fell silent. Even Parker seemed momentarily at a loss for words. "The bid is $1 million from Clearwater Developments," he finally announced. "Mr. Miller, do you wish to continue?" All eyes were on Thomas now. Henry Wilson was making a slashing motion across his throat, silently urging Thomas to stop this madness. The developers in the front rows had abandoned any pretense of disinterest, turning in their seats to observe the unexpected drama. Thomas took a deep breath. This was what Reynolds and Parker expected. For him to back down, overwhelmed by the sheer financial firepower arrayed against him. A simple farmer with 7,347. 15 to his name could never compete with a development corporation worth billions. But Thomas hadn't come to win the auction. He had come to expose the truth. "I'd like to address a procedural matter before we continue," Thomas said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. He reached into his father's leather satchel and removed a folder of documents. "I believe there's a serious question about the legal status of the water rights being auctioned today." Commissioner Parker frowned. "Mr. Miller, this is not the appropriate forum for—" "According to the original watershed survey from 1885, Thomas continued, raising his voice slightly to be heard over Parker's objection, "and confirmed by the County Water Assessment of 1947, the North Fork watershed has a significantly different flow pattern than what's being represented in today's auction materials." He held up two maps side by side. "The current survey being used for this auction shows the North Fork's primary flow feeding into Clearwater Reservoir, but the original survey shows it feeding directly into Blue River, serving what were historically 27 family farms." A murmur ran through the conference room. Victor Reynolds was whispering urgently to his legal counsel. Commissioner Parker's face had gone pale. "Mr. Miller, I must insist. Over 60% of the watershed's natural flow has been artificially diverted through manipulated creek beds and underground culverts constructed over the past 70 years, Thomas pressed on. "These diversions were implemented without proper environmental review or compensation to affected property owners, redirecting water that historically served agricultural properties to what is now Clearwater Estates." The whispers grew louder. Thomas could feel the momentum shifting, the energy in the room changing as the implications of his accusation began to register. "That's a serious allegation, Mr. Miller," Reynolds said, his voice dangerously quiet, "one that borders on slander." "It would be slander if it weren't documented," Thomas replied, pulling out more papers from his satchel. "I have here a sworn affidavit from Joseph Harmon, County Water Administrator in 1952, detailing systematic water diversion involving Judge Harrison, Commissioner Theodore Parker, your grandfather, I believe, Commissioner, and the Reynolds, Davidson, and Wilson families." Commissioner Parker's face had gone from pale to ashen. "This auction is temporarily suspended," he announced, his voice strained. "We'll take a 15-minute recess." But Thomas wasn't finished. "I also have evidence that this same pattern of manipulation has continued to the present day, with current county officials altering watershed surveys during drought years, always to the benefit of the same families, and now Clearwater Developments." The room erupted in chaos. Developers were on their feet, demanding explanations. Local farmers and property owners were pressing forward, wanting to see Thomas's documents. Victor Reynolds remained seated, his face a mask of cold fury as he stared at Thomas Miller, the simple farmer who had just publicly challenged Clearwater's carefully constructed water monopoly. The 15-minute recess stretched to 30 minutes, then an hour. Thomas remained in the conference room while most of the attendees spilled out into the hallway, speculating wildly about what had just happened. He sat quietly, the leather satchel open on his lap, reviewing the documents he had brought. He didn't look up when the conference room door opened and closed, nor when footsteps approached his seat. "Mr. Miller." The voice was cultured, controlled, but with an undercurrent of steel. Thomas finally looked up to see Victor Reynolds standing before him. Up close, the CEO of Clearwater Developments was even more imposing, tall and fit, despite being in his early 60s, with a tailored suit that probably cost more than Thomas's truck. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his manicured hands resting casually in his pockets, but his eyes were cold and calculating. "Mr. Reynolds," Thomas acknowledged, not rising. "That was quite a performance." Reynolds said, his tone conversational. "I'm curious. What exactly do you hope to accomplish here?" Thomas met his gaze steadily. "Justice. A flicker of something. Amusement? Respect?" crossed Reynolds' face. "Justice is a nebulous concept, Mr. Miller. Water flow is much more concrete. Whatever your father or grandfather might have believed about historical watershed patterns, the current county surveys are what matter in a court of law." "Surveys can be manipulated," Thomas replied. "As you well know." Reynolds glanced at the document spread across Thomas's lap. "May I?" Without waiting for permission, he picked up one of the maps. The original survey from 1885 showing the natural flow patterns of North Fork. "Interesting historical artifact," Reynolds said dismissively, "but hardly relevant to today's proceedings. Do you know how many water disputes arise from these old surveys? Equipment was imprecise, landscapes change naturally over time, and streams alter their own courses. And water administrators who document fraud die in car accidents," Thomas added pointedly. Reynolds' smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I understand your farm is facing foreclosure, Mr. Miller. That must be incredibly difficult after so many generations on the same land." He handed the map back to Thomas. "Perhaps we could come to an arrangement that would be beneficial for everyone." "I'm listening," Thomas said, though he had already guessed what was coming. "Clearwater would be willing to purchase your remaining acreage, let's say at twice its current market value. That would more than clear your debts, with enough left over for a comfortable retirement." Reynolds named a figure that made Thomas blink despite himself. "In exchange, you would agree to withdraw your concerns about the watershed boundaries." It was a substantial sum, enough to solve all of Thomas's immediate financial problems and provide security for years to come. The kind of offer that would be almost impossible to refuse under his circumstances. "And if I decline?" Thomas asked quietly. Reynolds' smile didn't waver. "Then you'll face the full legal resources of Clearwater Developments in any attempt to pursue these claims. Your documents would be challenged. Expert witnesses would testify to the unreliability of century-old surveys, and you would still lose your farm to foreclosure while drowning in legal fees." He paused. "I'm offering you a dignified exit, Mr. Miller, for your father's sake, if nothing else. Edward was a reasonable man." The mention of his father sent a jolt through Thomas. "You knew my father?" "Riveroak Valley is a small community." "At heart," Reynolds replied smoothly, "our families have been neighbors in a manner of speaking for generations." He checked his watch, a subtle gesture designed to indicate that Thomas's time was running out. "Think about my offer. You have until the auction resumes." With that, Reynolds turned and walked away, joining his legal team near the front of the conference room. He didn't look back, confident that Thomas would make the sensible choice. Thomas sat motionless, Reynolds' offer ringing in his ears. Twice the market value for his remaining land, financial security, an end to the constant stress of possible foreclosure. All he had to do was walk away from the truth, from the justice his father and grandfather had sought. The conference room door opened again, and this time Grace Thompson entered, making her way directly to Thomas. Her usually composed face was flushed, her eyes darting nervously to Reynolds' group huddled at the front of the room. "Thomas," she said in a low, urgent voice as she sat beside him. "What are you doing? Do you have any idea who you're up against?" "I have a pretty good idea," Thomas replied, gathering his documents back into the satchel. Grace leaned closer. "Commissioner Parker is on the phone with Judge Harrison right now. They're talking about having your documents impounded pending historical review. Once they're impounded, you'll never see them again." "I figured they might try something like that," Thomas said. "That's why I made copies, multiple copies, distributed to multiple locations." Grace's eyes widened. "You've been planning this?" 6 years, Thomas confirmed. Ever since I found my father's records. I just needed the right moment, a public forum where they couldn't simply dismiss the evidence. Grace glanced around nervously, then lowered her voice even further. Joseph Harmon was my great-uncle. Family lore always said his death wasn't an accident. Thomas stared at her in surprise. This was an unexpected ally. After you mentioned his name earlier, I went back to my office and checked something. Grace continued, reaching into her handbag. I keep a key to the old records room, the one in the basement where they store documents deemed not of current relevance. But most people don't even know it exists anymore. She pulled out a yellowed envelope, handling it carefully. This was filed the day before Joseph died. It was supposed to be entered into the official record, but never was. Thomas took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a formal legal document, a petition to the County Water Board requesting a comprehensive review of all water allocations approved during Mayor Davidson's father's tenure, citing substantial evidence of fraudulent practices. It was signed by Joseph Harmon, County Water Administrator, and notarized on May 17, 1952. He tried to bring it to light legally, Thomas murmured. And paid with his life, Grace added grimly. Thomas, I've worked in the Water Records Office for 28 years. I've seen things, documents that disappear, surveys that don't match from one year to the next, stream beds that change only on paper. She looked down at her hands. I always told myself it wasn't my place to question, but I can't be silent anymore. Before Thomas could respond, the conference room door opened once more. Commissioner Parker entered, followed by Judge William Harrison in judicial robes. Behind them came Sheriff Murray and 2 deputies. Here we go, Thomas muttered, securing the new document in his satchel. What are you going to do? Grace whispered, eyeing the approaching officials with alarm. Thomas took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth, the point of no return. If he accepted Reynolds' offer, he could walk away financially secure. His children would be relieved, his immediate problems solved. The path of least resistance was clear and tempting, but the weight of 4 generations of Miller farmers seemed to press on his shoulders. The documents in his satchel weren't just papers. They were his father's legacy, his grandfather's burden, his great-grandfather's stolen birthright. And not just theirs, but those of dozens of families who had lost their water access and subsequently their farms through systematic manipulation spanning more than a century. Mr. Miller, Commissioner Parker announced, his voice echoing in the now quiet conference room as people began filing back in. Judge Harrison has determined that your documents should be examined by county archivists to verify their authenticity before these proceedings continue. In other words, Thomas replied loudly enough for everyone to hear, you want to confiscate my evidence. Sheriff Murray stepped forward. Sir, we're just asking you to temporarily surrender the documents for proper authentication. It's standard procedure. Is it standard to have armed deputies present for document authentication? Thomas asked, noting the hands resting on their service weapons. A murmur ran through the gathering crowd. Victor Reynolds remained seated, watching the confrontation with clinical detachment, as if observing a chess match where he already knew the outcome. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. Mr. Miller, I'm issuing a direct judicial order for you to surrender those documents to Sheriff Murray for safekeeping and authentication. Failure to comply will result in contempt charges. The moment stretched taut with tension. Thomas could feel the weight of every eye in the room. Reynolds' cold calculation, Grace's fearful concern, the curious spectators, the other farmers who had lost water rights over the years. Even the portrait of the first water commissioner on the wall seemed to be watching, daring Thomas to challenge a system that had worked in favor of the powerful for generations. Thomas stood up slowly, the leather satchel clutched to his chest. With all due respect, Your Honor, I will not be surrendering these documents. Sheriff Murray stepped forward. Mr. Miller, Don't make this difficult. These records don't just belong to me, Thomas continued, raising his voice to be heard clearly. They belong to every family that's lost their livelihood through manipulated water surveys and diverted streams. They belong to the historical record of Riveroak Valley. He turned to address the whole room now, and, as of 30 minutes ago, digital copies of everything in this satchel were emailed to the State Environmental Protection Agency, the Federal Water Commission, and 3 different newspapers. A collective gasp went through the conference room. Victor Reynolds was on, his feet now whispering urgently to his legal counsel. Commissioner Parker's face had gone from ashen to crimson. "That's a bluff," Judge Harrison said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "My daughter Jennifer works for the Boston Chronicle," Thomas replied calmly. "My son Robert is an environmental attorney in Seattle, and my youngest, Emily, is completing her graduate thesis on water rights and sustainable agriculture. They've been helping me prepare this case for years." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone. "Would you like me to call any of them to confirm the emails went out automatically when I texted them a code word during our recess?" Sheriff Murray looked uncertainly between Thomas and the judge, waiting for direction. Judge Harrison seemed frozen, calculating the implications. Commissioner Parker had sunk into a nearby chair, loosening his tie as if struggling to breathe. Only Victor Reynolds remained composed. He stepped forward, straightening his suit jacket. "Well played, Mr. Miller," he said quietly, almost respectfully. "A strategic release of information beyond local containment. I underestimated you." "Most people do," Thomas replied simply. Reynolds turned to Judge Harrison. "Your Honor, perhaps we should adjourn these proceedings until all parties have had time to review Mr. Miller's documentation. Clearwater Developments, of course, wants to ensure that all water allocations are conducted with the utmost transparency and legality." The smooth pivot was masterful, already positioning Clearwater as a concerned corporate citizen, rather than the beneficiary of generations of water manipulation. Reynolds was cutting his losses, distancing himself from the county officials who now stood exposed. "The auction is suspended indefinitely," Judge Harrison announced, finding his voice at last. "All water rights previously scheduled for today's auction will be held pending further review." As the crowd erupted in excited conversation, Grace leaned close to Thomas. "You actually did it," she whispered. "But what happens now?" Thomas watched as Reynolds and his legal team made a dignified exit, as Commissioner Parker conferred urgently with Judge Harrison, as the other farmers gathered in small groups discussing the implications of what they'd witnessed. "Now," Thomas said, "we follow the evidence wherever it leads. The truth has been buried for too long." He had made his choice. There was no going back now. The documents in his satchel and their copies spreading across the state would ensure that the water manipulation of Riveroak Valley would finally be exposed. Whether that would save his farm remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, Thomas felt the weight of an inherited burden begin to lift. He had honored his father's silent quest for justice. Whatever came next, that knowledge gave him a peace that no amount of money could have provided. The sudden transformation from obscure farmer to the center of a county-wide controversy hit Thomas with full force as he drove home that afternoon. News traveled fast in small communities, and by the time he turned onto the gravel road leading to his farm, his phone had been buzzing constantly with text messages and calls from neighbors, old friends, and even local businesses he frequented. The familiar sight of his weathered farmhouse silhouetted against the setting sun brought a momentary sense of peace, but as Thomas parked his truck and climbed out, the weight of what he had set in motion settled heavily on his shoulders. His 15 remaining acres, once just a small fraction of the Miller family land, now felt like the last stronghold in a battle that had suddenly become very real and very public. Inside the house was quiet, except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock that had belonged to his great-grandfather. Thomas placed the leather satchel carefully on the kitchen table, then sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation at the administrative building was fading, leaving him to face the stark reality of his situation. His phone rang again. Jennifer, his eldest daughter, calling for the third time. He finally answered. "Dad, what the hell is going on?" Her voice was tight with concern. "I just got calls from 2 different editors asking me about documents from Riveroak Valley. They said my father was making allegations about systematic water diversion." "It's a long story, Jenny," Thomas sighed, rubbing his eyes. "But I did tell people at the county auction that you and your siblings were helping me with this." "What, Dad? I don't know anything about—" "I know," he interrupted. "It was a bluff. I needed them to believe the documents were already beyond their reach." Silence on the other end, then, "Jesus, Dad, do you have any idea how serious this is? You're accusing powerful people of fraud and conspiracy using my name and position." The disappointment in her voice stung worse than any confrontation at the auction. "I'm sorry for involving you without permission," Thomas said. "But these documents are real, Jenny. The fraud is real. Your grandfather knew it, and I've spent 6 years confirming it." "You need a lawyer," Jennifer said flatly. "This isn't something you can handle on your own. These people have resources, connections. I know that." "No, I don't think you do." Her voice had taken on the sharp, professional tone she used in her investigative reporting. "If what you're saying is true, you're threatening not just current business interests, but decades of water allocations. That affects every property owner in the county, not just Clearwater Developments." Thomas hadn't fully considered this angle. In his focus on exposing the fraud and seeking justice for the original farm families, he hadn't thought through all the implications for current property holders who had purchased homes in good faith. "I'm flying in tomorrow," Jennifer continued, not waiting for his response. "Robert is trying to get a few days off too. We need to see these documents and figure out exactly what we're dealing with." After hanging up, Thomas walked through the quiet house, pausing at the photographs that lined the hallway. 4 generations of Miller farmers standing proudly on their land. His father, Edward, stern and taciturn in every image, even on his wedding day. His grandfather, George, with hands like gnarled tree roots from decades of working the soil. His great-grandfather, William, the first miller to settle in Riveroak Valley, standing before a much larger farmhouse than the one that remained. Thomas's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Many people support what you did today. But be careful. Eyes are watching." No signature, no clue to the sender's identity. As if to confirm this cryptic warning, the beam of headlights swept across the front windows as a vehicle turned into his driveway. Thomas tensed, remembering Joseph Harmon's accident after he'd tried to expose the water fraud. He moved to the kitchen drawer where he kept an old revolver, a family heirloom he'd never had cause to use. The vehicle stopped, its engine idling. Through the front window, Thomas could make out a county sheriff's cruiser, not Murray himself, but one of his deputies. The cruiser remained for several long minutes, its presence both a message and a threat, before finally pulling away. Thomas released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The reality of his situation was becoming clearer by the minute. He had challenged not just individuals, but an entire system, a system with the power to enforce its will through official channels. The sheriff's deputy was just the beginning. His phone rang again. This time it was Robert, his son. "Dad, I'm at the office trying to make sense of what's happening," he said without preamble. "The Seattle Environmental Journal called our firm asking for comment on a developing story involving water rights in Riveroak Valley. My boss wants to know why I didn't disclose a potential conflict of interest." "I'm sorry, son," Thomas began, but Robert cut him off. "Save it. Jennifer filled me in. I can't believe you dragged us into this without even telling us." His voice was tight with anger. "Do you have any idea what this could do to my career? I'm up for a partnership position." The disappointment in his children's voices was harder to bear than any confrontation with Reynolds or the county officials. They didn't understand, couldn't understand, what this land and its water meant, what the truth meant. "I did what I thought was right," Thomas said quietly. "Right for who, Dad?" "Certainly not for your family, not for the farm you claim to care so much about." Robert's words were clipped, professional, the voice he likely used in the courtroom. "If you'd sold when we suggested, none of this would be happening. You'd have financial security, and we wouldn't be caught in the middle of what's shaping up to be a legal nightmare." After the call ended, Thomas sat on the porch steps, watching darkness settle over his remaining acres. The distant lights of Clearwater estates glowed on the horizon, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Had he made a terrible mistake? Was his pursuit of justice nothing more than stubborn pride, as his children believed? The sound of tires on gravel once again broke the evening stillness. Thomas stiffened, prepared for another intimidation visit from the sheriff's department. But the headlights belonged to an old pickup truck he recognized, Henry Wilson, who had been at the auction. Henry was in his 70s now, thin and weathered, with the same bright blue eyes that had once been a Wilson family trademark throughout the valley. He approached the porch slowly, leaning on a walking stick. "Evening, Thomas," he said, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes. "Heard you caused quite a stir today." "Word travels fast," Thomas replied, gesturing to the step beside him. "Sit, if you'd like." Henry lowered himself carefully onto the porch step. For a moment, both men sat in silence, looking out at the darkening fields. "My father always said the water allocations weren't right," Henry finally said, "but he didn't have proof, just an old man's suspicions." "I have proof," Thomas said. "Documents my father collected, survey maps that don't match, witness statements from the 1950s. Henry nodded slowly. "Your daddy was a careful man, watched and waited, never said much but saw everything." He turned to look directly at Thomas. "You know they'll come after you hard. Reynolds, Parker, all of them." "Already started," Thomas replied, thinking of the sheriff's cruiser. "My own children think I've lost my mind." "Kids don't understand what the land means," Henry said with a shrug. "Can't blame 'em. World's different now." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is why I came. Found it among my father's things when I was clearing out his house after the foreclosure. Thought you should have it." Thomas unfolded the paper. It was a handwritten letter dated 1969 from Edward Miller, his father, to Henry's father, Frank Wilson. "Frank, regarding our conversation about the creek diversion, I found something that confirms your suspicions. The county water survey from 1965 doesn't match the original documentation. The natural spring boundary has been moved nearly 200 yards. In Davidson's favor, I've added this to my collection, but we need more before we can act. Parker and Reynolds control too much now. We need to be patient, wait for the right moment. Keep this between us for now. Too dangerous to involve others. My son will continue what we've started if necessary. Edward Miller." Thomas's hands trembled as he read his father's words. The letter confirmed what he had suspected, that his father had been methodically gathering evidence for decades, waiting for the right moment to expose the fraud. And he had expected Thomas to continue the work if necessary. "Dad kept it all these years," Henry said quietly. "Never showed anybody else. Told me about it on his deathbed. Said to make sure it got to you if anything ever came up about the North Fork water rights." "Thank you," Thomas said, carefully refolding the letter. This was more than just another piece of evidence. It was confirmation that he was fulfilling his father's wishes, continuing a quest for justice that had spanned generations. "There's something else," Henry added, his voice dropping even lower. "Something Dad told me that wasn't written down, about original stone markers along the creek beds." Thomas leaned closer. The original watershed markers were stone monuments, placed by the first county surveyors to establish official water boundaries. Most had been lost or removed over the decades as properties changed hands and new water surveys were conducted. Dad said there's one still in place on the Blue River headwaters, hidden in an old stone wall near where the river forks around, Eagle Rock. If that marker is where Dad said it is, it proves the original watercourse, physical evidence that can't be explained away like paper documents. "I need to find it," Thomas said, his mind already racing with the implications. A physical watershed marker from the original survey would be irrefutable evidence, far more compelling than century-old documents that could be challenged as inaccurate or fraudulent. "Not tonight," Henry warned, glancing meaningfully toward the road where the sheriff's cruiser had appeared earlier. "They're watching. Wait until you have help. Your kids coming?" Thomas nodded. "Jennifer tomorrow, Robert soon after." "Good. You shouldn't be alone right now." Henry struggled too, his feet wincing as his joints protested. "I'm staying at my sister's place in town for a few days. Call if you need me." After Henry left, Thomas returned to the kitchen and spread out his father's documents on the table. Among them was an old survey map from 1885 showing the original watersheds of Riveroak Valley. He found the river fork Henry had mentioned, with Eagle Rock marked as a landmark. If the original stone marker was still there, it would provide physical proof that the watercourses had been altered. But Henry was right. Tonight was not the time to go searching. Too many eyes were watching. Too many powerful interests were mobilizing against him. He needed to be strategic, patient, just as his father had been. Thomas carefully packed everything back into the leather satchel, including Henry's letter. For the first time since the auction, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, he had unleashed forces that might be beyond his control. Yes, he had complicated his children's lives and potentially endangered his own. But he was continuing a quest for justice that his father and Frank Wilson had pursued silently for decades. As he climbed the stairs to bed, Thomas's phone buzzed. With a final text message of the day, it was from Emily, his youngest. "Just heard from Jenny. Don't worry, Dad. We've got your back. Researching watershed law now. See you soon. Love you." Despite everything, Thomas smiled. Perhaps his children understood more than he'd given them credit for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new confrontations with the reality he had created, but tonight he would sleep knowing he wasn't standing alone. Thomas woke before dawn, a lifetime of farming, having ingrained the habit too deeply to break. For a moment, in the grey half-light filtering through his bedroom window, it felt like any other day. Then, the memory of yesterday's confrontation at the auction flooded back, along with the weight of what lay ahead. He moved through his morning routine mechanically, coffee, toast, a quick check of the weather forecast. A gentle rain had fallen overnight, leaving the fields damp and the air fresh. Under normal circumstances, he would have spent the day tending to his small vegetable garden, or repairing the barn door that had been damaged in last month's windstorm, but nothing was normal anymore. As he sipped his coffee on the porch, Thomas noticed a black SUV parked on the county road a quarter-mile from his driveway. It was too far to make out details, but the implication was clear. He was being watched. The reality of his situation was setting in. He had challenged powerful interests, and they were responding in kind. His phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "Landing at 10:15. We'll rent a car. Be there by noon." Brief and to the point, typical Jennifer. She had inherited his father's taciturn nature, expressing herself more readily through action than words. Thomas spent the morning organizing his father's documents more systematically, creating categories, original surveys, correspondence, newspaper clippings, and witness statements. He wanted everything clear and accessible when Jennifer arrived. She would approach this like the investigative journalist she was, demanding evidence and logical connections. As he worked, he heard a vehicle coming up the driveway. Glancing out the window, he saw Grace Thompson's sedan pulling up to the house. The county water records administrator stepped out, looking nervously toward the road where the black SUV remained parked. "They're not even trying to be subtle, are they?" she said when Thomas opened the door. "Coffee?" he offered, gesturing toward the kitchen. Grace nodded, following him inside. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes, suggesting a sleepless night. "It's been chaos at the administrative offices since yesterday," she said, accepting the mug Thomas handed her. "Emergency meetings behind closed doors, lawyers coming and going. Commissioner Parker has been on the phone non-stop." "Have they contacted you directly?" Thomas asked. "Not yet, but they will." Grace's hands trembled slightly as she held her coffee. "Judge Harrison was asking about access to the old records room. He's never shown interest in county archives before. They're looking for ways to discredit the documents," Thomas concluded. It was the logical move. Attack the evidence, question its authenticity or relevance. "Among other things," Grace hesitated, then added, "there are rumors they're preparing legal action against you for slander and disruption of county proceedings." Thomas had expected as much. It was a standard tactic. Use the legal system to drain the resources of anyone who challenged the status quo. "My daughter Jennifer is flying in today. My son Robert will be here tomorrow. Both of them have connections to legal resources." Grace nodded, seeming relieved. "That's good. You shouldn't face this alone." She reached into her purse and pulled out a USB drive. "I came to give you this. I spent last night scanning every document in the old records, room that pertains to water rights during Judge Harrison's father's tenure. If they're planning to lose records or restrict access, at least we'll have copies." Thomas took the drive, surprised and moved by Grace's courage. "This could cost you your job." "Probably will," she acknowledged with a wry smile. "But I've been administrator for 28 years, eligible for retirement anyway, and I can't be silent anymore, not after seeing your evidence and remembering all the irregularities I've noticed over the years." They were interrupted by Thomas's phone ringing, a local number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Miller?" a young woman's voice said when he answered. "This is Amanda Reyes from the Riveroak Weekly. I'm hoping to get your comment on the allegations you raised at yesterday's county auction." News traveled fast in small communities, but this was faster than Thomas had expected. "I don't have any comment at this time," he said cautiously. "Our sources say you have documents proving systematic water diversion involving county officials and prominent business leaders." The reporter persisted. "Is that accurate?" Grace was watching him intently, her expression cautioning restraint. "All I'll say is that I've discovered significant irregularities in county water records spanning multiple decades," Thomas replied carefully. "I'm in the process of organizing this information for appropriate review. Will you be providing your evidence to state authorities?" "No comment at this time," Thomas said, then ended the call. Almost immediately, his phone rang again. Another unfamiliar number. He silenced it, then watched as a text message appeared. "Mr. Miller, Victor Reynolds here. The situation has escalated unnecessarily. My offer still stands, with an additional incentive. Please call to discuss." Grace had been reading over his shoulder. "They're getting nervous," she observed. "Reynolds wouldn't reach out directly unless he was concerned about where this is heading." Thomas nodded, setting his phone aside. "Which means we need to be even more careful. They'll try every approach. Threats, bribes, legal maneuvers, maybe worse." The stone marker Henry Wilson mentioned could be crucial, Grace said. Physical, evidence that can't be easily explained away or made to disappear. Thomas looked at her in surprise. How did you know about that? Grace gave a small, enigmatic smile. Henry and I dated in high school before he took over his family's orchard. We've kept in touch. This unexpected connection reminded Thomas how intertwined lives were in small communities, a network of relationships spanning generations. It made the systematic water diversion all the more insidious. It had corroded the trust that bound neighbors together. If the marker is where Henry says it is, on the Blue River headwaters, we need to document its existence before they realize its importance, Thomas said. Grace's expression grew serious. That won't be easy. The headwaters area is on county land now, part of the Clearwater conservation easement. Sheriff Murray has probably been instructed to keep an eye on it. We need a legitimate reason to be there, Thomas mused, thinking aloud, something that wouldn't raise suspicion. Grace considered this for a moment. What about a fishing expedition? The spring run of cutthroat trout starts next week. Henry has a valid fishing license, and that area is open for catch and release. No, they'd be suspicious if I went along, Thomas pointed out. You wouldn't have to, Grace countered. Henry and I could go. I haven't been fishing in years, but my license is still current. We could document the marker with photographs and GPS coordinates. If anyone asks, we're just old friends enjoying a day on the water. The plan had merit, but Thomas was reluctant to put Grace at further risk. She had already taken a significant chance by copying the records and bringing him the USB drive. Let me think about it, he said. My daughter will be here soon. I'd like to get her perspective before we make any moves. Grace nodded, understanding his caution. She finished her coffee and stood to leave. I should get back to the office before they notice I'm gone. I'll keep my eyes and ears open. As she headed for the door, she paused. You know, I've worked with 3 generations of county commissioners, all following the same playbook, all benefiting from the same systematic water diversion. No one has ever challenged them like you did yesterday. Whatever happens next, remember that. After Grace left, Thomas returned to organizing the documents, but his mind kept drifting to the stone marker. If it was indeed still in place, it would provide physical evidence that the watershed boundaries had been altered. Evidence far more compelling than century-old papers. But accessing the Blue River headwaters now, when all eyes were watching, carried significant risk. By noon, dark clouds had gathered, and rain was falling steadily. Thomas made a pot of soup for lunch, his mother's recipe that he'd cooked countless times in the years since Margaret's death. The familiar task was soothing, a reminder that despite the turmoil he'd unleashed, some patterns of life continued, unchanged. He was setting the table when he heard a car in the driveway. Through the rain-streaked window, he saw a rental car pull up and Jennifer emerge, dragging a small suitcase behind her. She hurried to the porch, shaking water from her coat before entering. At 34, Jennifer Miller had her mother's auburn hair and her grandfather's penetrating gaze. She worked as an investigative reporter for the Boston Chronicle, specializing in corporate corruption and environmental issues. She was sharp, meticulous, and relentless once she caught the scent of a story, qualities that made her an excellent journalist, but sometimes a challenging daughter. "You look tired, Dad," were her first words as she entered the kitchen, giving him a quick, tight hug. "It's been an eventful 24 hours, Thomas replied dryly. Jennifer unpacked her laptop and a stack of folders, claiming half the kitchen table as her workspace. "Robert's flight gets in tomorrow morning. Emily is trying to reschedule her final exams so she can join us by the weekend." She paused, surveying the organized piles of documents. "This is what started all the trouble?" This is what exposed the truth, Thomas corrected gently. Jennifer nodded, acknowledging the distinction. Whatever her initial reaction to being unwittingly involved, her professional instincts were clearly engaged now. Show me what you have. For the next 2 hours, Thomas walked her through the evidence he had gathered, his father's documents, Grace's contributions, Henry's letter, and the tantalizing possibility of an original stone marker that could prove the watershed boundaries had been altered. Jennifer took meticulous notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions or suggesting additional connections. Despite her initial anger at being dragged into the situation, she couldn't hide her growing interest as the scope of the fraud became clear. "This isn't just about a few acre-feet of water here and there," she said, reviewing a sequence of survey maps that showed the gradual alteration of watercourses over decades. "This is systematic theft on a massive scale, facilitated by county officials and benefiting the same families for generations." "That's what I've been trying to tell you," Thomas said. Jennifer was already typing rapidly on her laptop. "We need to build a comprehensive timeline connecting the document evidence to specific water diversions and property development. The personal connections are crucial too. The family relationships between judges, commissioners, and beneficiaries." Thomas recognized the focused intensity in her expression, the same look Margaret used to get when tackling a complex problem. Jennifer might have questioned his methods, but she wasn't questioning the substance of his allegations anymore. "What about this stone marker?" she asked, pointing to Henry's notes about its location. "If it's still in place, it would be physical evidence that the original watershed boundaries were different from what's in current county records." Grace suggested she and Henry could go look for it under the pretense of a fishing trip, Thomas explained. Jennifer considered this, drumming her fingers on the table. "It's risky. If they're caught searching for survey markers instead of fishing, it would raise immediate suspicions." She thought for a moment longer. "But the potential evidence is too valuable to ignore. Let me make some calls first, see what legal standing we have." As Jennifer made her calls, moving to the living room for privacy, Thomas gazed out at the rain-soaked fields. The black SUV was still parked on the county road, a persistent reminder of the forces aligned against them. But for the first time since the auction, he felt something close to optimism. Jennifer's professional skills and connections combined with Robert's legal expertise and Emily's research abilities might be exactly what was needed to navigate the challenging path ahead. When Jennifer returned, her expression was thoughtful. "I spoke with a contact at the State Water Resources Board, off the record. They're interested in what we have, but need more concrete evidence before they can get involved officially. The stone marker could be the tipping point. So we proceed with Grace's plan." "With modifications," Jennifer replied. "I'm going with them. As a journalist, I can document everything professionally, and having an out-of-state observer makes it harder for local authorities to interfere without raising questions." Thomas wanted to object to protect his daughter from potential risk, but he recognized the determination in her eyes. Jennifer was like him in more ways than she probably realized, with the same stubborn commitment to truth and justice. "There's something else you should know," Jennifer added, her tone softening. "I did some preliminary research on Clearwater Developments and Victor Reynolds before flying out. Reynolds' company has development projects in 5 states, all following a similar pattern, targeting rural counties with valuable water resources and complex property histories. This may be bigger than just Riveroak Valley." The implications were staggering. If the same fraudulent practices had been applied across multiple jurisdictions, the scale of the water theft would be enormous. But it also meant that exposing the truth here in Riveroak Valley could have far-reaching consequences, potentially helping countless other communities facing similar exploitation. "One step at a time," Thomas said, bringing the conversation back to the immediate challenge. When do you want to visit the Blue River headwaters? Tomorrow, Jennifer decided, after Robert arrives. We'll need his legal expertise if we encounter any official resistance. She looked out at the black SUV, still visible through the rain. In the meantime, we should assume everything we say and do is being monitored. Thomas nodded, the reality of their situation setting in once more. They were challenging a system that had operated unchecked for generations, a system with deep roots in the local power structure and connections that extended far beyond Riveroak Valley. The path ahead would require careful navigation, strategic thinking, and unwavering commitment. But looking at Jennifer, professional, focused, already formulating a plan of action, Thomas felt a surge of pride and hope. Whatever happened next, he was no longer standing alone against the powerful interests that had exploited his community for decades. The quest for justice that his father had pursued in silence was now gaining momentum, emerging into the light where truth could finally prevail. The rain had cleared by morning, leaving the world washed clean and glittering under a bright sun. Thomas rose at his usual hour and found Jennifer already awake, her laptop open at the kitchen table, surrounded by documents and empty coffee mugs. She had the focused intensity of someone who had been working for hours. "Did you sleep at all?" Thomas asked, moving to start a fresh pot of coffee. "A few hours," Jennifer replied without looking up from her screen. "I've been mapping connections between water allocations and county officials. The pattern is undeniable. Once you know what to look for." She turned her laptop toward him. On the screen was a complex diagram showing water rights transactions spanning decades, with lines connecting watersheds to county officials, judges, and prominent families. At the center of the modern web was Clearwater Developments, which had acquired dozens of water rights over the past 15 years. "The really interesting part," Jennifer continued, "is how the altered watersheds always benefited the same set of families until about 1995. Then suddenly those families started selling to corporate entities that eventually consolidated under Clearwater. It's as if they knew something was coming and wanted to distance themselves." Thomas studied the diagram, impressed by Jennifer's ability to organize complex information so clearly. What triggered the change in the mid-90s? "Still working on that," she admitted, "but I found references to a state environmental investigation that was suddenly dropped around that time. No public explanation." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car in the driveway. Through the window, Thomas saw Robert stepping out of another rental car. At 31, his only son had his height and build, but Margaret's darker coloring and quick, decisive movements. As an environmental attorney in Seattle, Robert had developed a reputation for meticulous preparation and uncompromising ethics. The kitchen door opened and Robert entered, setting down his briefcase and overnight bag. Unlike Jennifer's rumpled appearance after her all-night research session, Robert looked fresh and professional in slacks and a button-down shirt, as if he might need to appear in court at any moment. "The black SUV is still there," he noted, pouring himself coffee. "Did you get the license plate?" Thomas asked. "Obscured, deliberately, I suspect." Robert nodded, unsurprised. "I've been making calls. Reynolds's legal team has a reputation for aggressive tactics in water rights disputes. They've been sued twice for intimidation and once for evidence tampering, though nothing was ever proven." "That fits with what I found," Jennifer added, turning her laptop toward her brother. "Look at the pattern of water acquisitions. Clearwater targets areas with complex water histories, often with indigenous claims or historical watershed disputes." Robert scanned the information with the quick comprehension of someone used to absorbing complex legal details. Classic pattern of legal vulnerability exploitation. They find situations where water rights are contestable, then use their resources to ensure favorable outcomes. Thomas watched his children with a mixture of pride and concern. They had seamlessly transitioned from initial shock and anger to professional engagement, bringing their respective skills to bear on the situation. But he was acutely aware that he had drawn them into a potentially dangerous confrontation with powerful interests. "I appreciate what you're both doing," he said quietly, "but I need to be clear about something. This isn't just about saving the farm anymore. That might not even be possible at this point. It's about exposing the truth, regardless of the personal consequences." Jennifer and Robert exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "We know, Dad," Robert said finally. "And while I still think you should have consulted us before making those claims at the auction, I understand why you did it." He set down his coffee mug. "The evidence is compelling. This goes beyond a simple water dispute. It's systematic fraud facilitated by public officials. That's something I can't ignore professionally or personally." "Same here," Jennifer added. "This is exactly the kind of story I've built my career investigating. Corporate exploitation of rural communities, corruption in local government. It matters." Their support lifted a weight Thomas hadn't realized he was carrying. He had been prepared to stand alone if necessary, to face whatever consequences came from his actions. Knowing his children understood and supported his decision brought an unexpected sense of peace. "Now," Robert said, all business, "about this stone marker. Jennifer filled me in. It's legally sound. Henry has every right to fish in public waters, and Grace's presence as county water administrator is appropriate for any questions about regulations. Jennifer's addition as press provides another layer of legitimacy." "What about Sheriff Murray?" Thomas asked. "If he's been instructed to keep people away from the headwaters, he would need legal grounds to interfere with lawful recreational use of public waters," Robert replied. "And with 3 witnesses present, 1 a county official, 1 a lifelong resident with valid permits, and 1 an out-of-state journalist, any obstruction would raise immediate red flags." The sound of a truck pulling into the driveway drew their attention. Through the window, they saw Henry Wilson's pickup with Grace Thompson in the passenger seat. "Right on time," Jennifer said, grabbing her camera bag and notebook. "I told them we'd meet here first to coordinate our approach." The kitchen quickly became a strategy center as Henry spread out a hand-drawn map of the Blue River headwaters on the table, pointing to the location where he believed the stone marker was. "Hidden. My father showed me once, years ago," Henry explained, his weathered finger tracing the path of the river. "There's an old stone wall built by the first settlers where it meets the eastern spring. There's a large flat stone with markings on it. Underneath is the original boundary marker from 1885. "Why was it hidden?" Robert asked. "Dad said your grandfather and our father concealed it back in the 60s when they realized what was happening with the water diversions," Henry explained. "They were afraid if the marker was visible, someone would remove it entirely." Grace nodded, adding, "That fits with what I found in the archives." There was a systematic replacement of original watershed markers throughout the county in the 1970s, supposedly to modernize the water record system. Convenient time to modernize, right after hiding evidence of the original boundaries, Jennifer observed, making notes. They discussed their approach in detail, how they would enter the public lands, what they would say if challenged, how they would document the marker if found. Robert advised them on the legal parameters, stressing the importance of staying within the legitimate purpose of recreational fishing. "What fishing gear are we supposedly using?" Jennifer asked practically. "I've got everything in the truck," Henry replied. 2 extra rods, tackle boxes, waders, the works. I still fish that spot regularly, so it's not even a false pretext. Thomas listened as they finalized their plan, feeling a strange mixture of anticipation and apprehension. He wanted to go with them, to see this crucial piece of evidence with his own eyes, but he understood why he needed to stay behind. His presence would immediately raise suspicions, potentially jeopardizing the mission. "Be careful," he said as they prepared to leave. "Reynolds and his allies have a lot to lose if that marker confirms what we suspect." "We'll be fine, Dad," Jennifer assured him, checking her camera equipment one last time. 3 people, legitimate. Purpose, broad daylight. They can't stop us without raising more questions than they want to answer right now. Odin. As the 3 of them left in Henry's truck, Thomas found himself alone in the suddenly quiet house. The organized chaos of strategy planning gave way to the ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant sounds of birds outside. He moved restlessly through the rooms, unable to settle his mind, following Jennifer, Grace, and Henry on their journey to the Blue River headwaters. To distract himself, Thomas returned to the kitchen table where Jennifer had left her research materials. Her laptop was locked, but the printouts and notes were available for review. He began reading through the information she had compiled about Clearwater Developments' activities in other states. The pattern was both disturbing and illuminating. In county after county, Clearwater had acquired water rights with disputed boundaries or complex histories, often at prices well below market value. They typically entered a community gradually, purchasing a few key water allocations before expanding rapidly. Local opposition was neutralized through a combination of legal maneuvers, economic incentives, and occasionally, if these documents were to be believed, more direct forms of pressure. One case in particular caught Thomas's attention, a situation in an Arizona county where a rancher had raised questions about water diversions similar to Thomas's concerns. The rancher had subsequently faced a series of misfortunes: vandalism of irrigation equipment, sudden denial of loan applications, tax audits, and eventually foreclosure. The timing was too neat to be coincidental. Thomas was still processing this disturbing information when his phone rang. It was Jennifer. "Dad!" Her voice was breathless with excitement. "We found it! The stone marker is exactly where Henry said it would be. It's a granite boundary post embedded in stone with the county surveyor's stamp from 1885. "You're sure?" Thomas asked, his heart racing. "Absolutely certain. I have clear photographs, including close-ups of the markings." Grace brought a GPS device to record the exact coordinates. "We've documented everything, and the location confirms the original watershed boundaries." "What about the current water flow?" Thomas asked. "That's the smoking gun," Jennifer replied, her voice dropping slightly as if concerned about being overheard. "The current flow has been physically diverted nearly half a mile from the original spring. There's clear evidence of man-made alterations. Old concrete structures, buried piping. That represents thousands of acre-feet of water annually that was essentially stolen through manipulated waterways. This was the physical evidence they needed, proof that couldn't be easily explained away or dismissed as misinterpreted paperwork. The original boundary marker, still in place after more than a century, directly contradicted the current official water pathways. "Are you heading back now?" Thomas asked. "Not yet. There's something else." Jennifer's voice held a note of discovery. "While we were documenting the marker, Henry noticed something about the stone wall. Some of the stones have unusual markings on them, letters and numbers carved into the undersides, only visible if you know to look for them." "What kind of markings?" "We're still figuring it out, but they appear to be coordinates or reference points. Henry thinks your grandfather and his father created some kind of system to document the original watershed boundaries of multiple springs in the area, not just Blue River. If true, this would expand the evidence beyond a single boundary dispute." to a comprehensive documentation of the original water sources throughout the region, potentially affecting dozens of properties now controlled by Clearwater Developments. "Be careful, Jennifer," Thomas cautioned. "If what you're finding is as significant as it sounds, it represents an even greater threat to Reynolds and the others." "We're being cautious," she assured him. "Grace is officially documenting everything as part of a water quality assessment. We've even caught a few trout, so our cover story is intact." After they hung up, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, processing the implications of what Jennifer had discovered. The boundary marker alone was compelling evidence, but if his grandfather had indeed created a hidden system for preserving the original watershed boundaries, it could provide a comprehensive map of the altered waterways, proof positive of systematic fraud spanning generations. For the first time since the auction, Thomas allowed himself to fully consider the potential outcomes of their actions. If they succeeded in exposing the fraud, what would happen? Water rights throughout the county would have questionable legal status. Developments built on fraudulently acquired water sources might face supply challenges. The financial and legal implications would be enormous, affecting not just Clearwater, but countless property owners who had purchased homes in good faith. The complexity of unraveling such long-standing fraud was daunting, but Thomas found himself thinking of his father, methodically gathering evidence year after year, waiting for the right moment, never giving up on the pursuit of truth despite the obstacles. And before him, his grandfather, cleverly hiding boundary markers and creating a secret documentation system in stone walls. Thomas had stumbled into this confrontation almost by accident, driven by the immediate need to save his farm. But now, he understood that he was continuing a quest for justice that spanned generations, a quest that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge into the light. His phone buzzed with a text message from Robert. "Jennifer called me, coming back, to strategize next steps. This changes everything." Indeed, it did. What had begun as one farmer's desperate stand against foreclosure was evolving into something much larger, a potential landmark case of water rights fraud with implications that could extend far beyond Riveroak Valley. The evidence they were gathering could lead to criminal investigations, civil lawsuits, and a fundamental reassessment of water allocations throughout the region. The black SUV was still visible on the county road, a reminder of the forces aligned against them. But for the first time, Thomas felt they might actually have the evidence needed to challenge the powerful interests that had exploited his community for generations. The hidden potential of his father's documents combined with the physical evidence Jennifer was documenting created a formidable case. As he waited for Jennifer, Grace, and Henry to return, Thomas found himself thinking about the land itself, the fields and streams that had sustained his family for generations. Beyond the legal questions of water rights and boundaries, there was a deeper connection to the earth that no fraudulent survey could erase. That connection had driven his father and grandfather to protect the truth, even when they couldn't openly challenge the fraud. Now, it was driving Thomas to finish what they had started, whatever the personal cost might be. Outside, the sun was high in a clear blue sky, illuminating his remaining acres with a golden light that emphasized both their beauty and their vulnerability. Whatever happened next, Thomas knew that the quest for justice had reached a critical turning point. The hidden potential of evidence gathered across generations was finally emerging, like seeds long dormant, suddenly bursting into life after a cleansing rain. The atmosphere in Thomas's kitchen crackled with energy as Jennifer spread the photographs across the table. The images showed a granite post embedded in stone, its marking still legible after more than a century. RCW 1885. Riveroak County Watershed, 1885. Beside these were photos of the stone wall with various markings exposed where Henry had carefully shifted rocks to reveal what lay hidden beneath. "It's a coordinate system," Henry explained, pointing to the sequence of letters and numbers. "Your grandfather and my father created their own survey record hidden in plain sight. Each marking corresponds to an original spring, creek junction, or watershed boundary." Grace had brought her county archives knowledge to bear on the discovery. I cross-referenced some of these markings with the original survey maps. They match exactly with the 1885 boundaries, not the current official ones. Robert was already analyzing the legal implications. "This is physical evidence that can't be easily dismissed. Document authenticity can be questioned, but a boundary marker in its original location combined with these hidden records." He shook his head in amazement. They created a parallel documentation system when they realized the official records were being manipulated. Thomas studied the photographs with a mixture of pride and wonder. His grandfather and Henry's father had been more strategic than he'd imagined, preserving the truth in a way that couldn't be erased or altered. Their foresight had created a time capsule of evidence waiting to be discovered when the moment was right. "We need to document more of these markers," Jennifer said. "Establish a pattern across multiple watersheds. One marker could be explained away as an anomaly, but if we can show systematic water diversions throughout the county..." "That won't be easy," Grace cautioned. "Most of these areas are now controlled by Clearwater or its subsidiaries. After what happened at the auction, they'll be on high alert." As if to emphasize her point, Thomas's phone rang, an unlisted number. When he answered, Victor Reynolds's measured voice came through. "Mr. Miller, I understand there was some activity at the Blue River headwaters today." The implication was clear. They were being watched closely. Thomas put the phone on speaker so everyone could hear. "My daughter was helping an old family friend with some fishing," Thomas replied neutrally. "Nothing unusual about that." "Indeed," Reynolds's tone remained conversational. "Though I find it interesting that fishing required such thorough examination of an old stone wall." The room went silent. Someone had been watching them at the headwaters, reporting back to Reynolds in real time. "Henry Wilson knows those waters better than anyone," Thomas said. "Family tradition, you understand." "Of course." Reynolds paused. "Mr. Miller, the situation has evolved beyond our initial discussion. My offer to purchase your property stands, but I must be frank. Continuing down your current path will have consequences beyond what you may anticipate." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Reynolds?" "Not at all. Simply stating facts. The markers and documentation you're pursuing raise complex historical questions, but they don't change current legal reality. Water allocations established through decades of official surveys and transactions aren't easily overturned." "Unless those surveys were fraudulent," Thomas countered. "Unless those transactions were based on manipulated records." Reynolds sighed audibly. "Even if that were true, and I'm not conceding it is, think about the implications. Hundreds of property owners in Riveroak Valley would face uncertain water access. Developments built in good faith would be jeopardized. The economic impact would devastate the community." It was a clever angle, positioning Thomas as threatening the welfare of the entire county rather than seeking justice for systematic fraud. Robert was scribbling notes while Jennifer recorded the conversation on her phone. "The truth matters, Mr. Reynolds," Thomas said simply, "whatever the consequences." "Noble sentiment," Reynolds replied, an edge entering his voice. "But consider this. Your mortgage is held by Riveroak First Bank. The bank president sits on Clearwater's Regional Advisory Board. A simple administrative review of your loan terms could accelerate your payment schedule, making foreclosure imminent rather than merely likely." Robert leaned forward, mouthing silently, "That's illegal." That sounds suspiciously like bank fraud, Thomas said, taking his son's cue. Merely pointing out the interconnected nature of rural economies. Reynolds replied smoothly. Similarly interconnected are the agricultural supply chains your remaining operation depends on. I would hate to see your already struggling farm face additional challenges in securing necessary resources. The threat was veiled but unmistakable. Reynolds was prepared to use his influence to cut Thomas off from credit, supplies and services, essential to operating even his small remaining acreage. You've made your position clear, Thomas said, keeping his voice steady despite the anger building within him. I'm glad we understand each other. My door remains open if you reconsider. Good day, Mr. Miller. After the call ended, the kitchen erupted in indignant conversation. That was textbook intimidation, Robert said, still taking notes, implying he could manipulate your loan terms, threaten your supply chains, all while maintaining plausible deniability. He's scared, Jennifer observed. The boundary marker and stone wall evidence must be more significant than we realized. He wouldn't be making explicit threats otherwise. He's also showing his hand, Grace added thoughtfully, revealing the extent of Clearwater's influence over local institutions, the bank, supply chains, probably others we haven't identified yet. Henry, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. This is bigger than just water boundaries. They've created a system where they control everything: banking, supplies, county government. The fraud isn't just on paper, it's embedded in the whole economic structure. Thomas nodded, seeing the full picture emerge. Clearwater hadn't just acquired water rights through manipulated boundaries. They had systematically consolidated control over the entire regional economy. Anyone who challenged them could find themselves cut off from essential services and resources, a modern form of economic excommunication. The realization brought the stakes into sharper focus. They weren't just fighting for corrected watershed boundaries or justice for past fraud. They were challenging an entrenched power structure that had shaped the county's development for generations. We need to move quickly, Robert said, tapping his pen against the legal pad. Reynolds' call confirms they're monitoring us and preparing countermeasures. We should get this evidence to state authorities before they can interfere. We need more than what we have, Jennifer countered. The boundary marker is compelling, but it's one data point. If we can document more of these hidden coordinates, establish the system our grandfathers created across multiple watersheds. No, that gets harder with each passing hour, Thomas pointed out. Reynolds knows we found something at Blue River. He'll take steps to secure other areas, prevent access. Grace had been studying the photographs of the stone wall markings. There's a pattern here. I think these aren't just coordinates. They're a key to something else. She pulled out an old county map from her bag, spreading it on the table. Look, if you plot these markings as locations, they form a sequence, a path. They gathered around as Grace marked points on the map corresponding to the stone wall notations. When connected, they indeed formed a clear pattern, a route through what had once been farmland, but was now largely Clearwater Developments. It's a map to the other markers, Henry realized. They created a trail that only someone with the key could follow. This discovery energized the group. Their grandfathers hadn't just preserved individual boundary markers. They had created a systematic documentation of the original watersheds, hidden in a way that could be accessed by future generations if needed. It was ingenious and exactly what they needed to build an irrefutable case. As they were discussing how to follow this hidden trail, a truck pulled into the driveway, Sheriff Murray's official vehicle. Through the window, they could see Murray and two deputies approaching the house. Right on cue, Robert muttered. Reynolds makes threats, then sends law enforcement to intimidate us. Let me handle this. I should be the one, Thomas said, moving toward the door. Grace, get those photographs somewhere safe. Sheriff Murray was a tall man with a carefully maintained air of rural authority. Polished boots, crisp uniform, the studied casualness of someone used to being deferred to. Thomas had known him since he was a deputy, had even supported his first campaign for sheriff years ago. "Sheriff!" Thomas greeted him on the porch, blocking the entrance to the house. "What brings you out this way?" "Official business, Thomas," Murray replied, all professional formality. "We've received a complaint about trespassing and potential vandalism at the Blue River headwaters." "Vandalism?" Thomas couldn't hide his surprise. "That's absurd. Nevertheless, I need to speak with Henry Wilson and Jennifer Miller, who were reportedly on the property earlier today." Robert appeared beside his father. "I'm Robert Miller, environmental attorney. May I ask who filed this complaint?" Murray hesitated, clearly not expecting legal pushback. "The county commissioner's office on behalf of the Watershed Management District." "Interesting timing," Robert observed, "especially since Henry Wilson has a valid fishing license and has been using those waters for recreation for over 50 years. Grace Thompson was present in her official capacity as county water administrator, and my sister is a journalist documenting local traditions for a feature story." "I'm just following up on the complaint," Murray said, his certainty wavering slightly. "Standard procedure." "Of course," Robert replied smoothly, "and we're happy to cooperate with any legitimate investigation. However, I should note that any attempt to intimidate witnesses in what is now an active investigation into potential water fraud would be problematic." "Active investigation? By whom?" "I placed calls to both the State Water Resources Board and the EPA Regional Office this morning," Robert said, "based on evidence of systematic fraud involving county officials and possible environmental violations. They're reviewing the materials now." Thomas watched this exchange with quiet pride. Robert was handling Murray perfectly, professional, precise, and just threatening enough to make the sheriff reconsider his approach. "I see," Murray said after a moment. "Well, I still need to document what occurred at Blue River today as part of the complaint follow-up." "Of course," Robert agreed. Henry Wilson was fishing at his usual spot, as he has for decades. Jennifer Miller was documenting this for a potential human interest story about rural traditions. Grace Thompson was there in her official capacity. They observed nothing unusual about the watershed beyond what any visitor might notice. The explanation was perfectly reasonable, covering their activities while revealing nothing about the boundary marker or hidden coordinates. Murray seemed to recognize he was on shaky ground. "If that's all it was, then there shouldn't be any issue," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe it. "Just keep in mind that the headwaters area is environmentally sensitive. Future visits should be coordinated through proper channels." "Understood," Thomas said. "Was there anything else, Sheriff?" Murray glanced at the house where Jennifer and Grace could be seen through the window, deliberately arranging fishing gear on the table, creating visual evidence of their cover story. "That's all for now. But Thomas, for what it's worth, you're stirring up things that have been settled for a long time. Not everything should be disrupted, even with the best intentions." "Some things shouldn't stay buried, Sheriff," Thomas replied quietly, "no matter how long they've been hidden." After Murray and his deputies left, the group gathered again around the kitchen table, the atmosphere now charged with a new urgency. "Reynolds is escalating faster than I expected," Robert said, "using the sheriff to establish a pretext for limiting access to areas where evidence might be found." "Which means we need to move quickly," Jennifer added. "Follow this trail our grandfathers left before they can block us completely." Grace studied the map where she had marked the pattern revealed by the stone wall coordinates. "The next location appears to be on the old Peterson property, now part of Clearwater's Riverview Estates." "That's a residential area," Henry pointed out. "Houses, streets, completely developed." Any original markers would have been destroyed during construction. Maybe not, Thomas said, looking closely at the map. The coordinates point to what would have been the northeast corner of the Peterson farm. That area includes a small community park that Clearwater incorporated into the development. Preserved land with some of the original landscape features intact, including potentially original boundary markers. Or another stone wall with hidden coordinates, Jennifer realized. We can't all go, Robert cautioned. Not after Murray's visit. They'll be watching for any unusual activity around properties connected to the original farms. They ultimately decided that Jennifer and Henry would visit the park the next morning, posing as a journalist, working on a story about local green spaces and her guide to the area's history. The cover story was plausible, and Jennifer's press credentials provided legitimate reason for photographing landscape features. As evening fell, the black SUV remained parked on the county road, its silent presence a reminder of the forces aligned against them. Inside Thomas's farmhouse, the kitchen had transformed into a command center, laptop computers humming, documents spread across every surface, timelines and connection maps taped to walls. Emily, Thomas's youngest daughter, called to report she had rescheduled her exams and would arrive the following afternoon. She had already been researching legal precedents for water rights cases and had connected with a professor specializing in historical watershed disputes. For Thomas, watching his family mobilize around this cause brought a complex mixture of emotions: pride in their capabilities, concern for the risks they were taking, and a deep sense of validation. What had begun as his desperate stand against foreclosure had evolved into something much larger, a coordinated effort to expose generations of systemic fraud and challenge the entrenched power structure that had exploited his community. As he stood at the kitchen window, looking out at his land in the gathering darkness, Thomas thought about his father and grandfather, their patient, methodical documentation of the truth, their creation of a hidden system of evidence that had waited decades to be discovered. They had laid the groundwork for this moment, preserving the truth when they couldn't openly challenge the fraud. The critical turning point had arrived. Reynolds's threats and Murray's visit confirmed they were on the right track, uncovering evidence that threatened the very foundations of Clearwater's empire. Whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of Hillside Farm, but potentially the entire structure of water rights in Riveroak Valley and beyond. Thomas turned back to his family, and allies gathered around the table, planning their next moves. The path ahead was fraught with obstacles and dangers, but for the first time in years, he felt the momentum shifting. The truth, so long buried in hidden markers and secret coordinates, was finally emerging into the light, and once revealed, it could never be buried again. 6 months later, Thomas Miller stood on his porch, watching the sunrise over fields that were now legally protected by corrected water rights. The morning light caught the irrigation channels, now flowing with their rightful allocation from Blue River for the first time in decades. Not just his remaining 15 acres, but an additional 40 acres that had been restored to Hillside Farm through the settlement agreement. The State Water Resources Board investigation had confirmed what Thomas's documents and the boundary markers revealed: systematic water diversions spanning generations. Victor Reynolds had resigned as CEO of Clearwater Developments amid mounting legal challenges. Commissioner Parker and Judge Harrison were facing criminal charges for fraud and corruption. Sheriff Murray had taken early retirement rather than face an investigation into his role in the cover-up. Most significantly, the Riveroak Valley Water Restoration Act had been signed into law by the governor last month, creating a framework to untangle decades of fraudulent water allocations while ensuring no residential homes lost access. The legislation, drafted with substantial input from Robert, had become a model for other communities facing similar situations across the state. Thomas watched as a familiar pickup truck came up the driveway. Henry Wilson stepped out, moving, more easily these days, with a new hip replacement, paid for by the medical fund established in the settlement for those who had lost their farms due to the water fraud. "Morning, Thomas," Henry called, carrying a basket of peaches. "First harvest from the orchard. Thought you should have some." The Wilson family orchard was one of 12 farms being restored through the settlement. After 5 years of lying fallow under Clearwater ownership, the land was producing again, though it would take years for the newly planted trees to match what had been lost. "They look perfect," Thomas said, accepting the basket. "Come in for coffee." Emily made cinnamon rolls before she headed out to the watershed meeting. Inside the farmhouse, the kitchen that had once been a command center for their investigation had returned to its normal function, though evidence of their journey remained. Framed newspaper articles about the case, a published copy of Jennifer's investigative series that had won national recognition, and on the wall, a reproduction of the original 1885 watershed map, now officially reinstated in county records. Grace Thompson joined them an hour later, carrying a thick folder of documents. At 63, she had not retired after all, but had been appointed director of the new Riveroak Valley Water Trust, overseeing the restoration of natural watersheds throughout the region. The university research team finished their assessment of Eagle Mountain, she reported as Emily returned from her meeting. The concrete diversion structures Clearwater installed in 1997 can be removed this fall. They believe the natural springs will re-establish their original flow patterns within 2 years. Emily, who had put her expertise in agricultural science to work as the Trust's restoration coordinator, spread out the satellite maps on the table. That will restore water to the Eastern Valley for the first time in 25 years. 7 farms could be viable again. Thomas watched his youngest daughter with quiet pride. Instead of returning to complete her degree, Emily had decided to stay in Riveroak Valley, applying her knowledge to healing the land that had sustained her family for generations. Her professors had agreed to accept her work with the Trust as a thesis project, combining academic research with practical restoration. "Have you heard from Jennifer?" Grace asked, accepting a cinnamon roll. "She called last night," Thomas replied. "Her investigation into Clearwater's operations in Montana is moving forward. 3 counties there have now filed similar claims based on our case. Jennifer's series on water rights fraud had expanded beyond Riveroak Valley to document similar patterns across 5 states. What had begun as a local story had grown into a national conversation about water justice, corporate accountability, and the vulnerability of rural communities to resource exploitation. Robert arrived in the afternoon, driving directly from the airport. Unlike his sisters, he had returned to his life in Seattle, but his law firm had established a new environmental justice division with Robert as lead counsel. He visited monthly, splitting his time between family and the ongoing legal work that continued to emerge from the case. "The federal investigation is expanding," he announced as soon as he entered the kitchen. "Grand jury indictments are expected next week for 3 former Clearwater executives, including Reynolds. The charges include racketeering, fraud, and environmental violations." "What about the civil cases?" Henry asked. His family, along with others who had lost their farms, had joined a class action lawsuit against Clearwater and the county. "The judge ruled in our favor on the preliminary motions," Robert explained. "Clearwater's attorneys are now talking settlement. They know the evidence is overwhelming." The afternoon sun filled the kitchen as they shared a meal together, a tradition that had become weekly since the case broke open. Other farmers joined them, along with new allies who had emerged during the fight. The table that had once held documents exposing decades of fraud now supported dishes passed hand to hand, the simple communion of people who had stood together against powerful interests and won. After dinner, Thomas walked with Robert to the eastern field where the spring planting was showing promise. In the distance, construction equipment was visible where Clearwater's artificial reservoir was being dismantled, the landscape gradually returning to its natural contours. "I still can't believe how much has changed," Robert said, surveying the valley. "6 months ago, we thought we might save your farm. We never imagined all of this." Thomas nodded, thinking of his father and grandfather, whose patient documentation had made it all possible. They knew the truth would matter eventually. They just didn't know when. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd taken Reynolds' offer that day?" Robert asked. "If you'd sold the farm and walked away with the money?" Thomas considered the question seriously. The offer had been substantial, enough to secure his financial future, enough to solve the immediate problem. "I'd have had the money," he said finally, "but I'd have lost something more valuable, and so would everyone else in this valley." As evening approached, they gathered on the porch, where so many critical conversations had taken place during their struggle. A year ago, Thomas had sat here alone, facing foreclosure, watching the lights of Clearwater Estates mock his struggles. Now the porch was full of voices, plans, and laughter. The next morning, Thomas rose early as always, the habits of a lifetime unbroken by success. He made coffee and walked the boundaries of his land, now properly watered for the first time. In years, the soil was recovering, the natural balance slowly being restored. At the edge of his property, he paused at a small stone monument recently installed by the Water Trust. It marked one of the original boundary points from the 1885 survey, its coordinates matching exactly those hidden in the stone wall code. Similar markers were being placed throughout the valley, making visible what had been deliberately concealed for generations. Thomas placed his hand on the cool stone, feeling the connection to those who had come before, not just his family, but all the families who had worked this land, who had known the truth but lacked the power to confront it openly. They had protected the evidence, passed down the knowledge, and trusted that someday the moment would come when justice could prevail. As he turned back toward the farmhouse, Thomas saw a school bus stopping at the end of his driveway. Grace had arranged for local students to visit Hillside Farm as part of an educational program about water conservation and environmental stewardship. Emily would lead today's tour, showing the children the newly restored creek that ran through the property and explaining how watersheds connected everyone in the valley. Thomas watched as the children filed off the bus, their voices carrying across the morning air. Among them was Henry's grandson, who waved excitedly. These children would grow up in a different Riveroak Valley than the one Thomas had known. One where water flowed according to natural patterns rather than corporate interests, where the truth was marked in stone rather than hidden beneath it. The journey had begun, with a desperate farmer being laughed at during a luxury auction, challenging powerful interests with nothing but his father's leather satchel and the truth it contained. It had expanded to include family, neighbors, and, eventually, state and federal authorities. What Reynolds and his allies had dismissed as one man's futile stand had become a movement that transformed an entire community and beyond. As Thomas walked toward the waiting children, he carried not the burden of a solitary quest, but the satisfaction of a shared victory. The truth had finally found its moment, and like water returning to its natural course, had carved a new path forward for Riveroak Valley. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.